USS Massachusetts, or BB-59 as she was designated by the U.S. Navy, was the third South Dakota-class fast battleship to be built. She saw extensive action in both the Atlantic and Pacific theaters, including a duel with the French battleship Jean Bart. It is also believed that Massachusetts, or Big Mamie, fired the first and last U.S. Navy 16-inch shells of World War II. She earned 11 battle stars along the way for her service. She now resides at Battleship Cove in Fall River, Massachusetts, as a memorial to the citizens of her state that made the ultimate sacrifice during World War II. Now, let's dive into the remarkable career of the USS Massachusetts by exploring her construction, service life, and her post-war preservation. The South Dakota class consisted of 4 ships: Massachusetts and her sisters South Dakota, Indiana, and Alabama. They were the second class of fast battleships to be built by the U.S. Navy, after the preceding North Carolina class, and were designed to the same Washington Naval Treaty Standard displacement limit of 35,000 tons and had the same main battery as the North Carolina class. They were more compact and had better armor protection, but were very cramped ships, a problem that was exacerbated by wartime modifications that significantly increased the size of the crew. The ships can be visually distinguished from the earlier class by their single funnel, compared to the twin funnels on North Carolina and Washington. In designing the South Dakota class, the Navy sought to fix a number of deficiencies in the preceding North Carolina class, most notably the insufficient underwater protection and engine technology that was outdated. During the design process, it was established that the hull was to be 666 feet long at the waterline, incorporate a single internal sloped armor belt, be capable of at least 25 knots, and carry 9 16-inch guns. However, in case of rejection by the General Board, naval architects produced a series of alternatives. Among these were longer, faster ships armed with 14-inch guns and triple turrets, slower ships with 14-inch guns and quadruple turrets, improved versions of the North Carolina class, and a ship capable of 27 knots armed with 9 16-inch guns in a similar configuration to the North Carolinas. When it was all said and done, the primary design, with the waterline length of 666 feet, was the only plan that could meet the specified requirements for speed, protection, and armament. By late 1937, the proposed design was agreed upon, requiring only small modifications to save weight and increase the fields of fire. Crew berths and officer staterooms were reduced in size, along with mess halls, and ventilation ports were completely removed, forcing the ship to rely on artificial air circulation. The keel of Massachusetts was laid down on July 20, 1939, at Bethlehem Steel's Four River Shipyard in Quincy, Massachusetts. When completed, Massachusetts would have an overall length of 680 feet, a beam of 108 feet, and a draft of 35 feet. She displaced almost 38,000 tons, and when fully loaded with ammunition and stores, she displaced 44,500 tons. Due to Japan's decision to abandon the treaty system, the U.S. Navy had already invoked the escalator clause in the Second London Treaty while constructing the North Carolina class that allowed main armaments to increase to 16 inches in size. Thus, Massachusetts would receive the same main battery of 9 16-inch 45 caliber Mark VI guns as the preceding North Carolina class. These, just as in the North Carolinas, were housed in 3 turrets located on the center line of the ship, a super firing pair forward of the superstructure, and 1 aft. These guns were capable of hurling a 2,700-pound projectile 40,000 yards or 23 miles. Her secondary battery consisted of 25-inch 38-caliber dual-purpose guns mounted in twin turrets located amidships, 5 on each side of the ship. As designed, she was equipped with an anti-aircraft battery of 12 1.1-inch 75-caliber Chicago piano guns and 12 50-caliber M2 Browning machine guns. But due to the ineffectiveness of these weapons, she would be completed with a battery of 6 quadruple 40mm Bofors guns, in place of the 1.1-inch guns, and 35 20mm Oerlikon autocannons instead of the 50-caliber machine guns. Her anti-aircraft battery would be continuously updated throughout her service life during refits and overhauls. Massachusetts was protected by a main armor belt that was 12.2 inches thick, deck armor up to 6 inches thick, and 18 inches of armor plating on her gun turrets. Her barbettes were protected by 17.3 inches of armor, and her conning tower had 16 inches of armor protection. Massachusetts was powered by 4 General Electric steam turbines, each driving one propeller shaft, and using steam provided by 8 oil-fired Babcock and Wilcox boilers. Rated for 130,000 standard horsepower, her turbines produced a top speed of 27.5 knots. She had a cruising range of 15,000 nautical miles at a speed of 15 knots. Massachusetts had an SC air search radar installed in 1941 and fitted to the foremast, along with an SG surface search radar installed on the forward superstructure. This SC set would later be replaced with an SK set, and after the lessons learned during the Guadalcanal campaign by the Navy, a second SG set would be added to the main mast in late 1942. She would eventually receive a Mark 8 fire control radar later in the war, and it was mounted on her conning tower to assist in the direction of her main battery guns. She would also later receive Mark 4 radars to help direct her secondary battery. Massachusetts carried 3 Vought OS-2U Kingfisher float planes for aerial reconnaissance, and they were launched by a pair of aircraft catapults located on her fantail. Her peacetime crew as designed numbered 1,793 officers and enlisted personnel, but during the war, her crew would swell to 2,500 officers and enlisted personnel. This was mostly due to her greatly increased anti-aircraft armament. Massachusetts was launched on September 23, 1941, and commissioned into the fleet on May 12, 1942, after her fitting-out period was completed. After completing her shakedown cruise, Massachusetts departed Casco Bay, Maine on October 24, 1942, and 4 days later rendezvoused with the Western Task Force for Operation Torch, the invasion of North Africa. While steaming off Casablanca on November 8 as part of the invasion force, she came under fire from the incomplete French battleship Jean Bart, which was moored at a Casablanca pier. She returned fire at 0740, firing the first 16-inch shells by an American battleship in anger during World War II. Within a few minutes, she silenced Jean Bart's main battery with 5 direct hits from her main battery, including one that jammed the Jean Bart's only operational main battery mount in place. Then she turned her guns on French destroyers which had joined the attack, sinking 2 of them. She also helped sink 2 merchant ships, a floating dry dock, and heavily damaged buildings and docks in Casablanca harbor. Massachusetts also shelled shore batteries and blew up an ammunition dump. After this action, she headed for the United States on November 12th to prepare for Pacific duty, arriving in Boston a week later for a refit. This refit would last from late November until February 1943, and Massachusetts would have 6 more quadruple 40mm Bofors mounts added, including 1 each on the roofs of turrets 2 and 3. She would also get 24 more Oerlikons installed, bringing her overall total to 60. In February, she would get underway for operations in the Pacific Theater. Massachusetts arrived at Noumea, New Caledonia on March 4, 1943. For the next several months she operated in the South Pacific, protecting convoy lanes and supporting operations in the Solomons, including the amphibious assault on New Georgia in late June. Between November 19th and 21st, she sailed with a carrier group to strike the Gilbert Islands, and on December 8th, she shelled Japanese positions on Nauru Island under the command of Rear Admiral Willis Lee, along with the battleships North Carolina, Washington, and her sisters South Dakota and Indiana. This bombardment group represented the most powerful surface fleet the U.S. Navy had ever assembled to that point in time. On January 6, 1944, the Fast Carrier Task Force was created, and Massachusetts was added to the roster of Task Force 58.1 under the command of Rear Admiral John W. Reeves. In late January, Massachusetts would participate in the invasion of the Marshall Islands, bombarding Kwajalein and covering the landings there on February 1st. She would escort and protect the carriers as their air group struck the Japanese stronghold at Truk on February 17th. On February 21st to 22nd, Massachusetts helped fight off a heavy air attack on her task group, while it made raids on Saipan, Tinian, and Guam in the Marianas. She took part in the attack on the Carolines in late March and participated in the invasion at Hollandia, April 22nd. Retiring from Hollandia, her task force staged another attack on Truk. Massachusetts shelled Ponape Island May 1st, her last mission before sailing to the Puget Sound Naval Yard for an overhaul and relining of her gun barrels, which were well worn out by this time. She would also see some upgrades to her anti-aircraft battery during this overhaul. Massachusetts departed the West Coast in July and stopped at Pearl Harbor on the way, departing there on August 1st to rejoin the fleet in the Marshall Islands. Here she joined Task Force 38.3 as by this time 3rd Fleet had taken command from 5th Fleet, and all the subordinate task groups were renumbered from the 50s series to the 30s series of numbers. She would protect the carriers of her group during strikes in late August and early September in the Philippines at Luzon and Mindanao. Her task group departed the Marshall Islands October 6th, sailing to support the landings in Leyte Gulf. In an effort to block Japanese air attacks in the Leyte operation, she participated in a fleet strike against Okinawa on October 10th. Between October 12th and 14th, she protected forces hitting the island of Formosa. While part of Task Group 38.3, she took part in the battle for Leyte Gulf from October 22nd to the 27th, during which planes from her group sank 4 Japanese carriers off Cape Engano. After a brief stop at Ulithi for replenishment, Massachusetts and her task group returned to the Philippines to strike Manila on December 14th while supporting the invasion of Mindoro. Massachusetts sailed into Howling Typhoon Cobra on December 17th with winds estimated at 120 knots, but did not receive any significant damage as a result. However, 3 U.S. destroyers were sunk at the height of the typhoon's fury. Between December 30th and January 23, 1945, her task group struck Formosa and supported the landings at Lingayen. During this time, her task group roamed the South China Sea, destroying shipping from Saigon to Hong Kong, concluding operations with more airstrikes on Formosa and Okinawa. In early February, the Fast Carrier Task Force had reverted back to 5th Fleet Command, and Massachusetts was now assigned to Task Group 58.1. From February 10th to March 3rd, Massachusetts guarded her carriers during raids on Honshu. Her group also struck Iwo Jima by air for the invasion of that island. On March 17th, the carriers launched strikes against Kyushu, while Massachusetts helped repel enemy air attacks, splashing several enemy planes. 7 days later, she bombarded Okinawa, and she would spend most of April fighting off air attacks, while engaged in operations off Okinawa. In late May, 3rd Fleet resumed command of the task force, and Massachusetts' unit was accordingly renumbered Task Group 38.1. On June 5th, she passed through the eye of a typhoon with 100-knot winds, but again did not receive any significant damage. On June 10th, she shelled Japanese facilities in the Ryukyu Islands. The Fast Carrier Task Force sortied on July 1st for attacks on Honshu, initially concentrating on the area around Tokyo. On July 14th, Massachusetts was detached to form a task group with her sisters Indiana and South Dakota, along with 2 heavy cruisers and 9 destroyers. The ships were sent to bombard the industrial complex in Kamaishi, which included the Japan Iron Company and the Kamaishi Steel Works. This complex was Japan's 2nd largest iron and steel manufacturing center, and this was the first bombardment operation conducted against the Japanese home islands. 2 weeks later, she repeated the bombardment, this time targeting industrial facilities at Hamamatsu. For this operation, they were joined by the battleship HMS King George V and 3 destroyers of the British Pacific Fleet. Another attack on Kamaishi followed on August 9th, and the task group was reinforced by another of Massachusetts' sisters, the Battleship Alabama. It was here that Massachusetts fired what was most likely the final 16-inch shell fired in combat in World War II. Following the Japanese surrender, Massachusetts departed for the Puget Sound Naval Yard for an overhaul on September 1st. The work lasted until late January 1946, when she sailed south to San Francisco, California, before proceeding on to Hampton Roads, Virginia, which she reached on April 22nd. She was decommissioned on March 27, 1947 at Norfolk, Virginia, and assigned to the Atlantic Reserve Fleet. The Navy considered modernizing Massachusetts while she was in the Reserve Fleet. In March 1954, a program to equip her with secondary batteries consisting of 10 twin 3-inch guns was proposed, but the plan came to nothing. Another plan to convert the ship into a guided missile battleship arose in 1956, but the cost of the conversion proved to be prohibitive for the Navy. She would have had all 3 main battery turrets removed and replaced with missile launchers, and then would have had anti-submarine weapons and equipment to handle helicopters added. The cost of the project amounted to $120 million. Massachusetts remained out of service until June 1, 1962, when she was stricken from the Naval Vessel Register. While she was in reserve, the Navy removed approximately 5,000 tons of equipment for use on other naval vessels, including both of the explosive-driven catapults used to launch her floatplanes. After Massachusetts was stricken and slated for disposal, a group of her former crew lobbied to have the battleship preserved as a museum ship. The Massachusetts Memorial Committee successfully raised enough money to purchase the vessel from the Navy, including through a donation campaign by children in the state. And on June 8, 1965, the Navy transferred ownership of the vessel to the state of Massachusetts. 2 months later, on August 14th, she was anchored in Fall River, Massachusetts at Battleship Cove and open to the public. She is dedicated as a memorial to more than 13,000 Bay Staters from all branches of the military that gave the ultimate sacrifice during World War II. She also is the location of the state's official memorials to the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Persian Gulf War, and 9/11. Massachusetts was declared a National Historic Landmark and added to the National Register of Historic Places on January 14, 1986. In 1998, she was towed to a Boston dry dock, where several repairs were made to her hull and propeller shafts to help protect her from further corrosion. Since she was decommissioned in 1947, Massachusetts is still mostly in her wartime configuration, and much like North Carolina and her sister Alabama, serves as an excellent example of a World War II battleship and what life aboard one was like. I highly recommend a visit to Battleship Cove, if at all possible, because in addition to Massachusetts, there's also the destroyer Joseph P. Kennedy, Jr., the submarine Lionfish, a pair of PT boats, and numerous other exhibits. Thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button, comment and subscribe so that we can bring you more insightful content just like this.